When you view an infotext, webinar, or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you are agreeing to the terms posted at the webpage listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what infotext presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with infotext webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but Infotext reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our Transfer of Copyright Agreement at the webpage listed in the slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the webpage shown on the slide.
Hello everybody, Dan Hadaway here with Adam Reynolds.
Hello Dan, and hello everyone. It's good to be doing this presentation together this year.
And hey, we're going to tandem the R7 talk for 2025.
If you're one of our clients, you should mark your calendar for July 24th, 2025. That's when we're going to be celebrating our 25th anniversary and having the Infotext Jam as an appreciation event for all of our clients. You have helped us to get to where we are today. It's going to be a fun event, and we're looking forward to seeing you there.
Adam and I are having a good time learning. Been teaching Adam for years now. The everything involving the non-technical aspects of information security.
That's right, Dan. It's been a good time learning from you. But we're here today to present the top 7 risks moving into 2025. As mentioned, me and Dan are both contributing to this video this year. So which 4 risks are you going to go over today, Dan?
All right, and so let's go ahead and get started. I just want to remind everybody that, if you haven't seen me speak before, you're going to notice that I bring some cartoons into my presentation. And, I refer out to everybody from Hacker Guy, the person who represents, everything that brings us together today, the threats, as well as sometimes he'll represent vulnerabilities. Joe and Jane ISO, I'll kind of circle back around to them. But, banks right now, when it comes to information security, are dealing with the proverbial, those employees that are not understanding, they see security maybe as an inconvenience, especially for their customers. We have far fewer of those employees in banking, by the way, nowadays than we did in the early days of information security. Some of our employees might still be the people that are waiting for their retirement, and they're just not keeping up. They just can't handle some of the new technology. Most bankers, and by the way, a lot of our customers are Margaret the target, and we really got to, that's where a lot of our money is, by the way, so we've really got to look out for Margaret the target, right? But we've got, Joan Department. She represents most bankers and board directors, and really most people in our culture are multitaskers, and so you'll see she's got more than 2 arms because she's always busy on her phone and on her laptop, even while she's talking to people, and et cetera, et cetera. Personnel represents those bankers that, boy, some of them have even written the policies, but they're so polite that they prioritize politeness over policy enforcement sometimes. And Hacker Guy, by the way, he knows that. He loves these 2 people down here. He's actually actively right now, as you're listening to this, he's targeting these 2 people right here, right? And so we all collectively are Joe and Jane ISO. We are all collectively needing to step up to the plate when it comes to our responsibilities related to information security, and that's really what I want to talk about today. By the way, Bill 2K, he represents that customer that just doesn't really value his own identity, doesn't really, he argues with us, he sees our procedures as a big pain in the butt until he's compromised, and then he blames us, right? And so he's kind of a big problem we work with in banking as well. I coined a phrase way back on September 12th, 2001, that awareness was 9/11 instead of battle. I noticed way back then that awareness alone made us far more secure than we were the day before 9/11. I realize nowadays not everybody even remembers what it was like the day after 9/11. But if you do, and even months after, it was American citizens that tackled the shoe bomber in that airport in Detroit. And it was awareness that made us far more secure. And then for the next 25 almost years, I watched as that phrase, awareness is 9/11 instead of battle, proved itself again and again and again. My company watches bank networks, and so especially in the early days, we were involved in a lot of incidents where, gosh, if we could have had more awareness, the incident wouldn't have occurred. And so that's why I feel like banks are cybersecurity superheroes. And I know that kind of feels, like, wow, this guy's just buttering up the board. But look at this. In the pandemic, when banks were rolling out remote access and doing a lot of other things, PPP, you know what I'm saying? They accounted for less than 1% of all the data that was breached during that pandemic. And I kind of joke, this is small financial institutions, right? So, it includes credit unions, but only 32 breaches in the pandemic were, community-based banks, and we should be proud of that. We have really, whether we use the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine or not, banks have been supervised to stringent guidance since really 2006. I mean, some banks were supervised to, information security best practices since the late 90s. We work with an internet bank now, right? But most banks, once they had online banking, et cetera, started working with, auditors and examiners to stand up best practices that we should be proud of. We're really shining in terms of cybersecurity these days. And in fact, most of our breaches are coming from our vendors, and it's because they don't notice the sick birds, right? And that's kind of where the metaphor really applies to the responsibilities that a director might have, which is, are we looking for the sick birds in our coal mine? If we've spent all this money, standing up these controls, are we checking them birds? Since it is an online presentation, it's actually easier and easier to follow along if we talk about the top 4 risks and the top 4 controls together. And then we'll circle back around and we'll talk about how you as a director can help the team manage the risk that we're going to be discussing today, which is the risk of social engineering. There's a very important compliance tool that the FFIEC back on August 28th released a press release saying that they were retiring it effective August 2025. It's the cybersecurity assessment tool. Internet of Things has your team a little bit concerned, and then will ransomware ever drop off this list? And by the way, we publish a list every year, and social engineering or user awareness, it has been on that list since we started. Sometimes it's on the top of the list, sometimes it might be closer to the bottom of the list, but it has never come off the list since we first started publishing our top 7 risks each year.
That's very true. Social engineering is not going anywhere anytime soon. And the same is true about third parties. The 3 risks I'll be discussing are third-party risk expansion, and then 2 specific types of risk that arise from third parties, or specific types of third parties, cloud service providers in the 6th risk in our list this year, and then the risk that comes from the very use of third parties, that disruptions to those chains we rely on, including increasing costs and uncertainties moving into 2025 are increasing. But every year, we look at a few sources of inspiration for this list. Including our previous list, we also looked at a really good list of the top risks from ISACA, who governs information security best practices, especially for Sarbanes-Oxley. And then FSISAC, the Threat Monitoring Organization for Financial Institutions. They publish a great list as well. And then there are a lot of publications who issue reports around the end or beginning of the year, including from Verizon, CrowdStrike, Sonic Wall, really so we can try to understand what, everybody's seeing as well. But suffice it to say, we have arrived at our list for this year. So, Dan, would you like to start us off?
Let's just dive in to those risks then. Starting with social engineering. It is still in the top three. This is the Verizon Data Breach Information Incident Response Report. It's an annual report that people like me have started quoting annually. It's one we look for. It's pretty well, timed because, we're usually doing training like this at this time of the year, etc. And you can see that social engineering here in 2024 is still, a big problem. There was a huge breach, by the way, a couple of huge breaches. This is for financial and the insurance industry. And so, they kind of skew the numbers a little bit for banks. And so we feel like, people just making mistakes as they're using technology, and social engineering are really big risks. And there's good news and there's bad news when it comes to social engineering. The bad news is bad guys are taking advantage of us, right? We are trusting people by nature, and our productivity. We multitask, like I said at the beginning of the talk, and I'm just kind of focused in on the bad news. So let's also talk about the good news, right? Social engineering is really a canary in a coal mine if we have good heightened awareness. Because the way orchestrated attacks work now is that they start social engineering us and start asking questions about us once they've targeted us. And that the targeted attacks are the ones that could succeed in a bank, right? I have to forget our vendors where, we see a lot of targeted attacks succeeding. In a bank, they could succeed. And so when we take a call that's weird, we should see that as a sick bird, right? And so your team is always involved in an awareness process that really it involves really three different components, interactive components too. We have policies and procedures that educate various sub organizations of our bank, including everybody, right? The acceptable use policy is the policy that everybody signs off on. But we're also motivated by, helping, we motivate our employees to follow those policies and procedures by helping them understand why they're in place. Once people realize that MFA makes us as secure as an ATM debit card, where, all we have to use is a 4-digit PIN, now we're a little more, willing to cooperate with the, inconveniences that we have to go through to utilize MFA. And then finally, activating their awareness. Your auditors should be testing your team on a regular basis. You should be, running, phishing tests against your team, pretext calling tests, all those tests that are done. What they do is they put us in a position where we can tell our employees, hey, every time you answer that phone, it could be a test. Every time you click on a link, it could be a phishing test. For some reason, people are more motivated. People are more on guard if they think there's going to be a test than if it's a bad guy that we're trying to prevent from, creating havoc in our system. Nowadays, the thing that worries cybersecurity professionals is, voice cloning makes your coworker's voice a threat. We actually will have a clone of my voice go into audit kickoff meetings. I used to be pretty involved in the audit process at Infotex, and so, especially if they knew who I was, I'd be, oh, Dan's here, and I'd talk to them at the beginning of the meeting, and then when it was time to talk about pretext calling, we'd inform them that, hey, Dan's not actually here. It was a clone of his voice. And that usually, helps people realize that, hey, if you've got a system that's good enough, in 20 seconds, you can get a clone of somebody's voice. And therefore, our coworker's voice is a threat. And so now if the president calls up the bookkeeper and says, hey, I need you to transfer some money, it might not be the president. The bookkeeper needs to figure out a way of making sure that the president is truly the president. And the good news with that is that it's really not that hard. What we've kind of learned because of this threat is that out of wallet questions is what we call them. I hope you're asking them when people call up and ask for information about, your customers' accounts, right? We're probably asking them more than just, what's your account number? We might be asking them, what we call out of wallet questions. What's the amount of your last deposit, or, that sort of thing, if it's a risky transaction. Well, if the president calls up the bookkeeper and says, hey, I'd like you to transfer the money, the bookkeeper can just say, well, before I do that, since this is a phone call, right, where did we go golfing last week? The president might say, well, I don't golf, right? But do you see how easy it is? If we're working with somebody every day, it's really easy to ask our coworkers out of wallet questions. And so all we really need to do to fix that problem is A, make people aware of it. Do you see how awareness is 9/11 to the battle? And then make people aware of how easy it is to use out of wallet questions. And then really, give our employees permission to not trust each other's voice, which I know is weird, but it's how we can solve that problem. There are a lot of other controls that should be implemented, especially if you're using voice commands. If you got a telephone banking system or whatever, your people are probably working on the risk assessment right now for how are we going to protect the fact that we can no longer recognize. Are we going to use multi-factor on somebody's voice if their voice is a form of authentication asking for a risky transaction. Meanwhile, what are your vendors doing? This is the dating game, right? That's kind of what vendor management, we need to call the vendor up and ask them another question, right? Are your vendors testing their employees to make sure, and are they, do they have an awareness program centered around that form of social engineering? And that makes a really good, help you understand how important awareness is in social engineering. Speaking of awareness, you should be aware of the fact that your team is now probably in a little bit of a compliance project management initiation phase because the cybersecurity assessment tool was retired by the FFIEC. If you don't remember what that is, it is the tool that usually banks your size are probably looking to stay at evolving, but you might be looking at intermediate statements. If that resonates to you, if that language sounds familiar, it's a risk assessment process that has an inherent risk assessment, a residual risk assessment in a way. And it's kind of in a weird way trying to be a capability maturity model. But it caused banks way back in 2015 to make a lot of changes to their cybersecurity posture. And yet the last time it was updated was in 2015. I mean, people like me have been complaining for years now that it's getting old. And we've been recommending that our clients use other forms of cybersecurity assessment because in 2015 we didn't even have remote access into banks. As an example, we certainly didn't have, AI or even zero trust architectures and, that sort of thing. So how are you going to assess your cybersecurity controls is a concern your team is looking at. The bottom line is that the cat also had a lot of other weaknesses in it. And so it's almost like an opportunity for your team to maybe combine various assessments into one assessment that governs, a lot of different grounds, right? And so a lot of banks, including yours, are probably looking at different alternative cybersecurity assessment tools. And boy, there's a lot of them that could be used. In particular, the NIST cybersecurity framework was just recently updated. The new update is a really good framework. We just don't know when they're going to update it again. The CAT was based on the original framework. The new framework does include governance, which was a thing that we thought made the original cybersecurity assessment weak. And it addresses all the new technologies. It's just, when are they going to update again, right? Meanwhile, it's meant for the federal government. It's kind of like a job security thing, if you ask me, for the federal government. And so a lot of banks, if you can use the Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, great for you, but it is pretty cumbersome. There also is kind of a big question. We asked the examiners in the conference last year in April, and they were like, well, you could do that. And basically what we're doing is we're going into the generic implementation of the cybersecurity framework and comparing it to the CAT and then assessing the difference. Now, what level of the CAT? Baseline, evolving, innovative, but then also, are our examiners going to be okay with that? It is a generic implementation. The last alternative I'm going to queue up is one that we actually are using at Infotex now, and it is one that we think a lot of banks are going to adopt because it was written for financial institutions, and it's based on the cybersecurity framework. And so, it basically, they're touting a lot of reasons why it would really be good for banks. It's mapped to the CAT. It's also mapped to the other banking guidances. So it also helps. This is where you really might be able to save some time because you're killing many different birds with one stone. The third big risk is Internet of Things risk. And the biggest, I feel like, control related to the Internet of Things is defining what it is. All right. Some banks see, your smart ATMs as an Internet of Things, right? Some banks just look at, wearables or, whatever employees want us to plug into the network is probably an Internet of Things. So we first need to decide in your bank, what is an IoT device? Are we going to consider our security cameras and the DMZ that we hopefully have those in to be an IoT device and governed by those sorts of policies and procedures? Or is it a peripheral device on our network like our printers and, scanners and that sort of thing? You follow what I'm saying? And so there's a lot of different devices in banks that could be considered IoT devices. And with each of these devices, what makes them IoT is that they connect through the network to the internet, right? Or some IoT devices might connect to the internet without going through our network. And how are we going to govern them? If they're listening devices, they ought to at least be turned off during board meetings, as an example. And so, they increase the attack surface. They increase the unknown attack surface, I should say. In other words, a lot of the risk with IoT devices is we're not exactly sure what people are doing if they're not following policy. So we definitely need to stand up some policies that basically, and most banks already have these in place, by the way. It's one of the reasons why we're cybersecurity superheroes. We've been doing this for a while, right? But we should at least remind people, make them aware of the importance of those policies as it applies to IoT risk. You see how important awareness is? Because if we can make our management team aware of the fact that, hey, anytime anything gets plugged into the network, it might be IoT. Let's get together and do a risk assessment. Let's decide whether we should allow it to be plugged into the network. And if it is not plugged into the network, or if it is plugged into the network, let's make sure we're addressing privacy, security, and operational risk. You want that thing backed up, don't you? And that sort of thing, right? The controls, again, awareness training. Our patch management system needs to include firmware updates for the approved devices. We need to look for the Internet of Thing devices. Your SIEM, if it has rogue device detection, can do that. Network segmentation is why we want our cameras. Well, also because it doesn't slow down a network that doesn't need to be slowed down when, cameras have a lot larger images and that sort of thing. But also it makes it easier to manage those cameras, et cetera, et cetera. And if your vendors want access to your network, then we need to kind of figure out, all right, well, what do you have on your network from an IoT perspective? Are you managing that risk? We don't need to really know what's on their network, but we need to, again, ask. We're back to the dating game, right? Um, candidate, vendor number two. Do you have a program in place that manages the risk of the Internet of Things? The final and fourth risk is one that, let's face it, you should be afraid of. I feel like if you work in another business, for your business, especially if it's not a bank. Banks, I don't want to give us a false sense of security, but we've got the controls in place. If a ransomware attack unfolds in your organization, it's more because of the strength of the attackers than is the weaknesses of the attacked. But the ransomware risk for our employees, for our customers, and for our vendors, especially those that have connections into our organizations, is still huge. And the inherent risk is still huge. And the fact that, gosh, if you can get ransomware on a network, wouldn't it be amazing if it could be on a bank network? Right? I mean, look how they take credit for that. And so, let's face it, ransomware, it's the most profitable form of extortion, because you don't even have to design the tools that's used in it, right? There's ransomware for rent now. There's a ransomware as a service. You give them the target. You collect the information. You do everything that exposes them to more legal risk than what they're already doing, and you get the ransom. And then you can also outsource the collection of the money to an organization, right? We've all heard the stories. I do worry about this a little, and I don't know if you're sure what you know what we mean there, because we're a bank, and I'm going to circle back around to that, okay? But the controls for ransomware, again, awareness training. If we can make people aware of the risks of clicking on that link by putting it in our policy, educating them by helping them understand when you click on that link, it could bring ransomware onto the system, and then activating it by sending them links using KnowBe4 or PhishMe or whatever your bank is using to test your employees and activate their awareness. Obviously, we have to back up our data, but now it needs to be backed up in a way that it can't be changed, and in many different ways, and we want to test that, right? The EDR, I'm pretty sure I can't remember, banks are using EDR, they're using MDR, they're using next generation AVS, they're using all three. Segmentation, network segmentation is a very important and good control. If the ransomwares get access to the network where we're doing a little bit more risky things, that gives us time. If we are aware, if we have good technical tools, if our SIEM is a good SIEM and gives us a heads up that, hey, if there's somebody on this segment, we can beef up controls to protect the segments that actually have the information that we want to protect. And then incident response testing is one of the most important things we can do to prevent any incident from going bad, and to put us in a position where we can recognize the process as it unfolds and turn lemons to lemonade. And I actually have a movie about that you might want to watch if you're on the board, because it's called Lemons to Lemonade, and it's really meant to help board members understand what their role is in an incident.
Thank you, Dan, for going over the first 4 items on our list from this year. I'm now going to talk about the 5th item, third-party risk management. The one thing I want to note is that everything Dan went over, really except for the cat retirement, as that's more of a compliance item, well, which cybersecurity framework you're going to start using is much more than just a compliance item. Every company should have a good cybersecurity framework. But this issue is because the FFIEC is retiring the cat, and really more specific to financial institutions, while the other risks, social engineering, Internet of Things, and ransomware, are risks that our vendors face as well. As Dan mentioned, we need to be discussing the risks with our vendors. Get to know them like the dating game, depending on their particular services impact at the bank, of course. But third-party risk expansion, that's a pretty broad topic. In fact, the rest of this video will focus on third-party risks. Items number 6 and 7 in our list this year are cloud service vulnerabilities and supply chain disruptions. These are specific types of third-party risks that I believe warrant their own specific mention. But for this item, third-party risk expansion, I'll broadly speak to how risks related to third parties have been evolving, and why it's more important than ever to make sure we're managing the risks that arise when we use third parties. As financial institutions increasingly rely on third parties for critical services such as payment processing, cloud storage, and IT support, the security risks associated with these partnerships continue to grow. But this also isn't new. Using third parties allows banks to offer new services and products externally, and help increase productivity and resource allocation internally. A small community bank may not have the resources to host their own email, host their own core system, provide security operations 24/7, 365. And that's why we have third parties. It makes business sense. But with it comes risk. And this is hopefully obvious. We have a duty to protect our customers' information. And if we give that information to a third party, whether they host it or have access to it, it still falls on us to make sure that third party has the correct controls in place to protect that data. And when I say protect, of course I mean keep it confidential, but also that the information is available and correct. Integrity and availability, right? And as mentioned, if you work for a small community-based financial institution, chances are very high that you are outsourcing network security to an MSSP and probably not hosting your own core banking platform anymore. And there are many reasons to outsource. We use an MSSP because we cannot dedicate the manpower to someone watching our network 24/7, 365. Instead of paying an employee, or really multiple employees to monitor our network, because that's over 4 40-hour shifts a week, it's cheaper to use an MSSP. We outsource the core because we expect these third parties to provide services above and beyond what we could accomplish ourselves. We're not going to have employees who can manage, update, and code for our core application. The vendor who we get that from is going to, provide those services because that's what they do. It's their specialty. But it really all comes down to limited resources, either manpower or budget, that we use third parties. But the example of third parties I used, the core application, network monitoring, talk about critical services, right? My point here is that in 2025, outsourcing critical services isn't new, but it's still increasing, and not only for critical services. While I do specifically mention critical services because that's where our risk is highest, there's risk to some degree in any vendor. And I'm not going to go into the details much about third-party risk management. That's a video unto itself, actually one we published back in May of 2022. But in general, there are 5 what we call precepts to managing third-party risk. First is assurance, making sure the vendor has the correct controls in place and they are operating effectively through audit reports such as SOC 2s, similar to an IT audit or examination that we go through. Contract, provisions and stipulations in the contract are correct. Insurance, having the correct type and amount of insurance. Financials, how financially stable is the company in the long term. And then business continuity plans. Does the vendor have a plan to ensure services are delivered in adverse conditions? And so that's what our vendor management program should be looking at. But we must also incorporate vendor risks in our other programs, such as our business continuity plan, incident response plan. How will we respond if the vendor cannot provide services or if they have a breach? We need to be addressing that in our business continuity and incident response plans. As mentioned at the beginning of this movie, we looked for many sources of information when deciding on which risks to include our list. And this was published by Security Scorecard in December of 2024, so just a few months ago. But their report stated that 97% of the largest U.S. banks reported third-party breaches. And nearly all of those banks also suffered fourth-party breaches. I'm not going to get into fourth-party risks at this time, but as you can see, while this metric isn't, applicable to the smaller banks we work with, even at the largest institutions, this is a problem that they are facing, and it's almost an inevitability. In our company, we're an MSSP. We've been watching financial institutions for many years now. When an incident involving technology happens at one of our clients, we're involved. So we get to see what's actually causing incidents for our clients. And while, of course, there are one-off incidents here and there, the vast majority of incidents our clients have worked through in the past few years were the results of vendors being breached. And that's because if one vendor providing services to many different institutions gets breached, there's a chance it will trickle down to all of them. SolarWinds was a big one. It was a little while ago, but it's still the best example as SolarWinds was providing an IT monitoring and management solution platform named Orion. Hackers were able to put malicious code in the SolarWinds product, which was then pushed out to its customers, resulting in over 18,000 customers installing that malicious code. MoveIt. This breach was caused by a vulnerability in Progress Software's MoveIt file transfer tool. This one didn't have as big of an impact, but as it was happening, our examiner inquired as to whether we were using it. And I'm sure all our clients were asked the same by their examiners, because this was a tool that was used by the federal government. And then QSI. More of a regional or local impact one, but one that a decent-sized group of our clients had to address. So these are all examples where one large third party gets breached, and it impacts many more of their customers. And so my main points here are that we are increasingly using third parties for critical services. And while this isn't new, it's still increasing and presents real risk. As always, it's our responsibility to make sure third parties are protecting the information we give them or let them have access to. We need a robust third-party risk management program to address these risks, and we can even outsource this these days to another third party to help us with this. But we also need to make sure that our incident response program and business continuity programs address vendor risks. How would we respond if there was a breach at a critical vendor, or if they couldn't provide their services? So why are we doing all this? Vendors increase our attack surface. The more third parties that have sensitive information, and the more we rely on third parties for critical services, the more risk increases. And our vendors can be much bigger targets than us. They have many client-sensitive data. So our vendors can be a leading cause of incidents, and not just security incidents, but also business continuity events. So it's more important than ever to make sure we're addressing the risk created by those third parties. Sometimes there's nothing we can do about it. If Microsoft 365 went down for a day, what can we do as a small institution? Really, just wait until it's resolved, unfortunately. But we should have plans to address those risks in our vendor management program, in our incident response programs, and in our vendor business continuity program. Our sixth item this year is cloud service vulnerabilities. As mentioned previously, this is a risk that does fall under third-party risk expansion, but it's for a specific set of vendors or third parties, those in the cloud. And they have specific risks that come with moving into the cloud. We need to treat those providing cloud services differently than other vendors, because again, there are specific types of risk that comes along with these vendors. And one reason again is because those vendors will be hosting the information we give them. This is, of course, based on risk. At Infotex, we use pCloud, which I believe is short for personal cloud. We can upload and download files to that service over the internet. But we only use it for non-confidential information. I just typically think of it as public cloud because we should only really have publicly available information in there. The risk of a breach of pCloud is low because of the impact. But Microsoft 365, that's a cloud service as well. And that can have much more sensitive information in it, as well as an impact to productivity. So I'm going to focus on these cloud service providers that host sensitive information. but also those that provide critical services. We're seeing more and more IT environments move into the cloud. And if that's not a critical service, then I don't know what is. So first, let me define how I'm using the term cloud here. It's the internet. The service provider or services provided are over the public internet. Whether that's storage, processing power, or applications, it's being delivered over the public internet. And this isn't the best definition, but it's simple. What's a cloud service versus a web service? That doesn't matter much in what we're talking about here. The reason that cloud providers need additional scrutiny is that their services are available to anyone on the internet. There are, of course, access controls in place, but the services are not provided over private networks that have controls in place to restrict access themselves. That means anyone with internet access and the right username and password, barring two-factor authentication, of course, or other controls, has access to what we put in the cloud. But we are relying on that third party for those access controls and other controls, which are typically our responsibility to manage and use. I mentioned two-factor authentication. It's not a silver bullet, but almost a requirement these days for anything online. Just because the cloud provider offers that doesn't mean it's turned on or enforced. So we have more responsibilities when it comes to cloud providers compared to others. And of course, we do the standard due diligence in vetting these vendors. And actually, I shouldn't say standard, as I'm focusing on those cloud providers who have sensitive information, so we actually do our most thorough review of them. But we rely on them to implement and maintain the controls protecting our information, to have a business continuity program so they can still provide those services that we're relying on during adverse conditions. So there's areas where we need to do more work when looking at cloud providers than other vendors. And one big risk when it comes to cloud service providers are, of course, data breaches. As I mentioned earlier, a cloud provider is a much bigger target than our particular institution, right? And cloud service providers need additional scrutiny in their implementations because misconfigurations are not uncommon, as well as compromised credentials. Does anyone on the internet, again, with the right credentials, have a possibility of accessing our information? And we want to make sure employees are using strong credential protections, especially that they are not reusing passwords. And then downtime and service disruptions. As these services are provided over the internet, we rely on an internet connection to access them. And we rely on those services being up. But even the largest companies have issues from time to time. So, two big risks when it comes to cloud service providers are, of course, data breaches, that those cloud service providers failed to protect our information or we did not configure something correctly, as well as the risk of those vendors not being able to provide their services. So I've already mentioned this one, but misconfigurations are one of the top risk factors for cloud service implementations. And the fact that there is a shared responsibility model between you and the provider. They typically secure the infrastructure, they provide the security controls, but we need to understand what those controls are, implement them ourselves, and understand where our responsibility starts and theirs ends. And then another contributing factor is that these are not, our networks or resources. They're the third parties. We can have digital loss prevention and antivirus applications watching our computers, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention sensors on our network, but we don't have those same controls in the cloud. The tools that provide visibility into our devices and networks compared to the cloud. So it can be harder to detect when incidents happen and investigate them when they do. So I want to mention a few particular key cloud service control areas. And I've already kind of mentioned this, but access controls. For public cloud service providers, the access controls are what guard our information. We need strong identity and access management practices like multi-factor authentication, role-based access, and to ensure passwords are not reused across providers and websites or shared. And then data encryption. The data in the cloud needs to be encrypted, both in storage as well as transit. So even if a malicious actor does get access to our information, it would be protected. So, to sum this up, like I said previously, just about the vendors in general, the transition to the cloud is increasing. As always, it's our responsibility to protect that information. But we have additional considerations to think about specifically for cloud providers, such as enhanced access controls, data encryption, and misconfigurations. I saved this one for last, not only because this is related to third-party risks, but because it's a bit of an unknown. Well, some of it at least. A lot can change and is changing this year. The final risk is supply chain disruptions. Smaller financial institutions are more dependent than ever on a web of third parties, which I've stated a few times now, and disruptions to those supply chains are their own risk. First, software supply chain attacks. A little different than what you probably thought of when I said supply chains, but software supply chains have interesting risks. The interconnected ecosystems of third-party software we have today can bring benefits such as efficiency and innovation, but it also introduces significant risks, especially as software supply chains face new and sophisticated threats, oftentimes backed from nation-state actors. And then there are the more traditional risks to supply chains caused by geopolitical instability, conflicts, inflation, tariffs. A lot of these things are changing as we record this video in February of 2025. So I want to discuss two key risks that financial institutions must be aware of: supply chain attacks, software supply chain attacks, and disruptions to the more traditional supply chains. Starting off with supply chain attacks, which I didn't mention specifically before, but I did give an example of. In 2025, software supply chains have become one of the fastest growing threats in cybersecurity. These attacks don't target financial institutions directly, but instead compromise the third-party vendors they rely on, infecting widely used software updates and infiltrating systems from within. They attack the software suppliers who unknowingly push the bad software to their customers. And as I've already stated, we've seen big examples of this in the last few years. The SolarWinds attack in 2020 compromised thousands of organizations, including governments and banks. The Kaseya ransomware attack in 2021 impacted hundreds of businesses in a single strike. And more recently, we're seeing an increase in attacks against open source libraries and widely used financial software providers. And this is really from an awareness perspective, because you can do your best due diligence, have contractual requirements for these companies to protect your information, try and put every control in place to protect yourself, but we rely on these companies. So the likelihood is typically low, but when it happens, it's a big event. And so why is this happening more? Well, first, geopolitical instability. Global conflicts are happening now, and they're not slowing down. There are economic sanctions and tariffs being threatened and pulled back. Businesses like stability. You can plan better, have a better understanding of what the near and far terms look like. And that's getting much harder in 2025. And then financial instability, mainly because of the geopolitical instability, but prices are rising. And for a lot of the third parties you're using, that probably means they're going to be passing their increased costs to their customers. Even shipping is more expensive. And speaking of shipping, in the last 6 months or so, I believe there was a chance of 2 major port strikes that would have really impacted supply chains here in the US. And then going international, China, Israel, Taiwan. A lot of Intel and AMD chips are fabricated in conflict or potential conflict zones. TSMC. That's a source of contention in itself for this instability. But I digress. What I'm trying to get at is that software supply chain attacks, especially from state-sponsored actors targeting infrastructure and finance, could be a big risk in 2025 and is something to be aware of. And then costs in general, due to a multitude of factors, are going to be increasing, which can affect planned IT projects, hardware refreshes, especially if you haven't migrated to Windows 11 yet, and your third-party costs as well will probably be going up. This will have a direct effect on your budgets this year in IT. And hey, maybe somehow everything will get better, but we can't plan on that, unfortunately. So, what can we do about this? Enhanced vendor risk management. Dan even discussed the vendor management a bit when addressing his risks. And it's something you're probably already doing well. But it's the reinforcement of this risk that we want to bring to your attention, to double down on saying your vendor management program needs to be strong going into 2025. And then, develop contingency plans, which you're probably doing as well. But your business continuity programs need to address what happens when a critical supplier cannot deliver their services. And just like your incident response testing, Dan mentioned tabletop testing. Business continuity testing, including tabletops, are needed to ensure your programs are working correctly. And then diversifying supplier relationships within reason. You're probably not going to have a redundant email provider or a core service provider that you can quickly move to if your main provider is down, but you are going to have a backup interconnection at your data centers and primary locations. So diversify where you can, where it's reasonable, but also identify alternate providers and know where your reliance on third parties exists. And with that gets us to the end of our list this year. To list those risks one last time, they were social engineering, the cybersecurity assessment tool retirement, Internet of Things, ransomware, third-party risk expansion, cloud services vulnerabilities, and supply chain disruptions. So there are some new and evolving risks this year, and awareness is key. Everything comes after awareness. But not all of these threats may apply at your particular institution, or you may think you have better risks moving into 2025, and if you do, please let us know. We always like receiving feedback. But thank you everyone for listening and making it to the end of this video, and let's make this a great year. And again, don't forget to mark your calendars for July 24th, celebrating our 25th anniversary with the InfoTex Jam.